Okay, so now that we got all the pieces cut, the next step is to sand off these little burrs here, and that's just left over from the cutting process. No matter what you do, you're going to have a little bit of tear out. Now, the idea here is to take a sanding block, and at a very shallow angle, I simply make one pass. And the idea here is basically one of two things. Some of the fibers are going to simply get wrapped over backwards and taken off, and the ones that don't, what you're doing is the sandpaper is sanding through that very fine little connection point that's holding them on, and then they fall off that way. This may seem like a insignificant step, but it's very important, because if you don't, what's going to happen is those little fibers can get trapped in your glue joint, and of course cause gaps, and there's no gaps allowed in segmented turning. So it takes just a few seconds. Once you kind of get in the groove of it, it takes just a few seconds to do a piece. So we got about 48 pieces here, so I'm not going to bore you with all of them, but you get the idea, and we'll see you back in here in a few seconds, and we'll move on to the next step. And speaking of clamps, these are the ones that I use. And these are just your average hose clamp that you can pick up at any hardware store. And the reason I use them is for a number of reasons, actually. One, they are one of the only clamps that, of course, will clamp in a circle, and that's what we need. Secondly, they're reusable. You can use them over and over. They're very cheap. And also, you can connect as many as you want together, and that's very important, because we will do rings from 2 inches to 16, 18, however big your lathe can handle. So this is the style that I use. They're also very strong. So let me clear off the table, and I'm going to show you the procedure for gluing up some segments. So before we ever get the glue on the wood, there's a few things we need to get ready. First thing I do is dry clamp everything together, and this does a few things for me. First of all, I try and look at the grain, and with some woods like walnut, the sapwood is very distinct from the heartwood. So I try and find a pattern that blends it together in a way that's pleasing to me. I also try and get a clamping strategy. So here you can see we've had to clamp two hose clamps together, and what I want to do is get the piece clamped up and then back it off just a little bit, so that when the glue's on there and all these pieces are together, it'll slip on, and I don't have to be tightening and tightening to get it to snug up. This glue sets relatively quickly, so you don't really have that much working time. Something else is, when arranging more than one clamp together, I try and space the clamps out evenly. Here you can see I'm directly across from the other one. And also, I always try and position the knuckle or the barrel of the clamp on a flat spot. I don't want it here on a joint. It will push both of these segments further in. So I try and be out here, at all possible. And so with that done, we're actually ready to start gluing. Okay, so very quickly, let me give you a rundown of everything that you're going to need to glue these up. Now, starting with the bottom here, this is just a piece of laminate countertop, and hopefully if you know someone doing a remodel or maybe a contractor, you can get a piece. Of course, you could use wax paper just over your workbench if you'd like. Now, as far as glue goes, I'm sure that's a very touchy subject, but I'll show you what I use, and that's Titebond 2. I have never had a problem with this glue. It is pretty much impervious to water. It's not rated waterproof, it is water resistant. But what that means is, short of putting something in a dishwasher and running it for about a week, it hopefully will hold up. And again, I've never had it fail. And hopefully anyone that is using one of these bowls is not gonna, just let it soak overnight. Now, food safety, of course, is another issue. And if you read on the back of Titebond, it says that it is FDA approved for indirect food contact. And they are referring to cutting boards. It says so right on the labels. And, my theory is if it's good enough for a cutting board, it ought to be good enough for a bowl that is, of course, going to have a finish on it so the glue is hidden. And also, you're not producing a plate in which someone is going to be cutting, say a finished meal off of. Bowls are typically used to store fruit and that sort of thing. So again, that's the glue I use. You may want to do your own research on it, but I'm pretty sure you'll probably wind up coming back to the Titebond. I apply the Titebond using a disposable brush. And you can pick up packs of 20 or 30 at most woodworking stores. For the clamps, I use my drill with a 5/16 driver on the end of it, and that is for quickly cinching them down. For the final tightening, I use just like a nut driver, again with a 5/16 bit, to actually snug them down all the way. And once we've got the clamps on, what we're going to do is we're going to go back with our hammer and we're going to tap down every segment and make sure that they are seated and in their proper position. We don't want anything twisted or contorted in any way. So enough talk, let's actually get to gluing. Welcome back. So as you can see, we got all the rings glued together. I've got them hanging from the table saw here drying. And a few things I want to point out about that is, when you clamp these up, try and make sure to keep the hose clamp as centered as possible in the stock, and that way you get uniform clamping pressure. Another thing is, when you apply the glue to these pieces, put 2 very light coats on either side. Don't put one heavy coat on one piece and then hope that the clamps, push it together and then the glue spreads that way. If you put too thick of a coat of glue on, the glue itself can actually hold the pieces off. I've found that out. So 2 very, very thin coats. Another thing, talking about the faces of the segments, is sanding. Do you sand the face of the segment before you glue it together or not? That is really up for debate. Most of the time, I do not. Now, that basis is on the wood I use. On a very hard wood, especially this lignin vitae, there's really no tear. It's just a very clean cutting wood, plus it's very waxy, so it cuts extremely well. Walnut, while it is softer than that, is still a hard wood. So again, I look at the face of the piece and then decide if it needs to be sanded or not. If it is, I sand it. If not, I don't worry about it. Another thing, if you get too smooth of a surface, it's hard for the glue to stick to it. So I prefer to, again, a case-by-case basis, look at it. If I was cutting pine, cedar, poplar, something soft like that, I would touch up the faces of the segments on the disc sander prior to gluing them up. So, I'm going to leave that up to you. That's your call. See how your pieces look. And of course, that depends on the blade too, if you're using a good sharp blade or not. And another thing about sanding the faces of the segments, you have to be careful. You could certainly freehand the piece by just pushing it up against the disc. Be careful not to get that angle off. Otherwise, you're going to have problems on down the road. So, of course, you could build a jig for the disc sander. And again, you're kind of opening up a can of worms. But now, in some cases, this is necessary. So, again, look at your segments, and you decide for yourself if you need to sand or not. On this particular bowl, we didn't sand now.